Hello and welcome to new and returning viewers. Today I'm doing my reading wrap-up from 2023 and going through the books that I read in October, November, and December. I'll also be talking about Goodreads and some of the great information that you can get there, both about your own reading as well as books in general. Because if you're like me, as my shirt says, just one more chapter, especially when you're into a book that just keeps you going and there's great information, whether you're reading nonfiction or fiction. And as I go through my reading summary, you'll definitely see how my reading varies between subjects, genres, all of that. I am happy to say that in 2023, for the second year, I did finish my reading challenge that I had set through Goodreads. That was a nice accomplishment, and I've set my goal a little bit lower for 2024, partly because what I find is that I tend to get caught up in the number of books that I've set to be read, and that in itself tends to throw some of my planned reading off schedule. I'll also show you at the end of the video all the books that I still have waiting to be read. And yes, it is quite a pile of books. Let me know in the comments down below. Are you like me and sometimes you get excited about a title, you start reading a book, but then something else pulls your attention and then the book you started gets put off to the side? Onward to October. The first book I read was by Zecharia Sitchin. This is The Lost Realms, and it's book 4 of the Earth Chronicles. I'll be talking more about Zecharia Sitchin's theory and the 6 volumes of the Earth Chronicles in an upcoming video. It may even become part of the series Hoax or Holy Grail, and I'll talk more about that new series in an upcoming video as well. Next, I read The Cosmic Code, which is book 6 of the Earth Chronicles. So, silly me, didn't pay attention to the Roman numerals at the bottom, and I ended up reading the last book before book number 5. The nice thing with this series is each book could be read individually as Zecharia presents different information, connections, and correlations to his premise that the Sumerians were involved in creating humanity as we know it. It's an interesting theory, and I believe worth the read, although there are a number of things I tend to disagree with. But it's an important read, and keeping in mind, his information is based on what was known at that time, and he did 30 years of research to put the 6-volume series together. I particularly enjoyed it because he makes a variety of connections, talks about a number of different cultures, not just the Sumerians. It gives you some food for thought, but again, you have to consider what was known when he put this information together. What I do find astounding is that there are so many more Sumerian tablets just sitting around in museums collecting dust that nobody has gotten to and that have yet to be interpreted. So when someone finally gets around to doing that, we'll have more information in terms of, was Zecharia on the right track, or is there something else from that yet to be translated information that we don't know yet? It's important to remember that when you're reading anything about ancient civilizations and archaeology. People can only make assumptions and take their best educated guess based on the information and the discoveries that were made at the time of putting that together. After all, it's not like we have a time machine yet where we can go back and find out whether those guesses or conclusions were correct. And each time a new discovery is made, there, of course, are new theories and new ideas put forward. But I did very much enjoy reading Zechariah's Earth Chronicles, and they patiently waited on my shelves for over 10 years. I decided to take a break from the Sumerians for a little bit, and I read Sasquatch. This is by Rupert Matthews, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. This was published in 2008 by Arcturus, and that's a publisher you'll hear me talking quite a bit about, as a number of the books that I have are published by them. On the back we have Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yowie, Yeti. The idea that monstrous man-apes lurk in the remote forests and high mountain valleys of the world is an enduring and popular one. Hardly a week goes by without some report of a fresh encounter. Sasquatch is also another topic that will be coming up in my Hoax or Holy Grail series. It will be later in the year, as with that particular series, I'll be taking an in-depth look at a particular topic. I decided to go back and finish the Earth Chronicle series. This is When Time Began, and it's book 5 of the Earth Chronicles. So as I said, I ended up reading them out of order, but that was okay because each book, as I say, is a standalone and a different part of the story with the Sumerians and theory that Zechariah has based on his research. Next, I decided to read Paranormality again. This is by Professor Richard Wiseman, Why We Believe the Impossible. It's interesting because on the back it says, Professor Richard Wiseman is clear about one thing. Paranormal phenomena don't exist. So his entire book talks about why he believes there is no such thing as the paranormal. It was an interesting read. I don't agree with all the things that he came up with, but he certainly does make some good points. I'll definitely be covering this in an upcoming video. The next book that made sense to read after Paranormality was The Afterlife Frequency, the scientific proof of spiritual contact and how that awareness will change your life. In other words, this is the exact opposite of Paranormality. This is written by Mark Anthony, a lawyer and a medium. The stories here were very interesting. They're not woo-woo type of stuff. And it definitely is some food for thought. I very much enjoyed reading both of these one after the other because, of course, each claims to have proof. One that the paranormal doesn't exist and the other that it does exist. It's also interesting that the foreword in this book is by Gary E. Schwartz, a researcher that I hadn't heard of before, but comes up in my final book of 2023. So again, things come up when it makes sense or you need to learn them, because had I not read this book and learned a bit about Gary Schwartz, it wouldn't have had the same impact reading the other book. Let me know if you find that with your reading as well. That was everything in October. November was more of a started out nonfiction and then went into a fiction month. So I began with The Intention Experiment. This is by Lynne McTaggert. And I did forget to mention, The Afterlife Frequency is a book that I borrowed from my public library first, and as I began reading it, I realized it was something that I would refer back to more than once, so I purchased my own copy. The same with The Intention Experiment. I borrowed this from the library a number of years ago. It was interesting, but at that time I didn't think that I would end up pursuing it or referring back to it. Last year I read The Field by Lynne McTaggert, and she is someone that I find to be very interesting. If you're someone who believes that you create your reality or that a group of people focused on something can change how the world works, be sure to check out Lynne McTaggert. You can find her on Facebook as well as other social media. I'll leave the title of all the books I'm talking about and the authors down in the description box below if you want to look a little further into them. I found this book to be an enjoyable read, and I actually found it at my local thrift store, which was nice because it meant it cost $4.50. So I really enjoy going to the thrift store because not only do I find excellent reads, I get a bargain, and that money goes back into the community as well as providing jobs for people who work at the thrift stores. So it's a win-win-win. I'll be talking more about this book as well as noetic science in an upcoming video as well. Next, I went on to reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Strange Tales. I'd heard of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I've seen movies about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it was only this year that I read this work by Robert Louis Stevenson. I finished the other short stories as well, and I'll be talking more about them in an upcoming video. After Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I read Frankenstein, another classic that I've known about for years. I knew that it was written by Mary Shelley. I didn't realize how long ago it was written. And like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it speaks to that question of when has science gone too far? I've seen movies of Frankenstein, but this was my first time reading the actual novel that all of those are based on. And yes, it did come from the Indigo discount section, so it was $7. I'm really glad that I had a chance to read this, and I found it to be a very enjoyable story. The Time Machine and Other Stories. This was the last book that I needed to finish from my H.G. Wells box set, which I've talked about in a previous video. In this case, I had read The Time Machine back when I was in high school, which is, let's just say, a decade or two ago. And I recently read it again. I've also seen movies based on it, which are quite a bit different than the actual story. And there were other short stories that I hadn't read by H.G. Wells before, and I'll be covering that along with the other short stories by Robert Louis Stevenson in a different video. Isaac Asimov would be a name familiar to anyone who reads science fiction and is a fan of that genre. I picked this book up last year, and it had been waiting on my shelf for a little while for me to get to it. And as I say, November seemed to be my fiction read month, so I read Foundation. What I didn't realize at the time is that this is a series. So now I have to check out whether the rest of them are at my public library. I think a couple of them are. And I'll have to decide whether I want to go on to see where this whole concept goes. I enjoyed the read, but you really don't get to know the characters very well as the time jumps in huge increments, so we go from decades between the different sections. Another book I read, and yes, this is Tiki's Little Tale, Another book that I finally finished was Mysteries and Secrets of Time. This is by Lionel and Patricia Fanthrope. I've started this book a couple of times and I just couldn't get into it. It isn't their writing style, it just wasn't something that was speaking to me at the time. So this time when I started it, I made a decision that I was going to read the entire book, which I did. They have some interesting ideas and thoughts about time, how it works, different explanations, and of course, it tied in with other works that I've read. So for me, a big part of 2024 and part of why I put my reading goal lower is that this year I really want to start gathering the books together and start compiling all that information and making those connections. And that, of course, will be part of the Hoax and Holy Grail series. On the back, the authors say, this fascinating work begins with a scientific appraisal of time and its relationship with 3D space. It explains in clear, understandable language the complex theories of such famous men as Newton, Einstein, and Hawking. Is time infinite, or does it have a beginning and an end? As I say, we'll be taking a closer look at that later in 2024. I finished November by reading the Lovecraft Compendium. Earlier, I had read The Dunwich Horror, a story that I remembered reading when I was in high school. I didn't remember the specifics, and it is the only Lovecraft story that I'd ever read. A little while later, I watched a program about H.P. Lovecraft on Prime, and it got me interested in both the individual and the stories that he had written. And as you can see, yes, I am that person who writes in my books. And I did that to try and keep the different stories straight. In the program about Lovecraft, it of course talked about Cthulhu and the other characters that he created, and those stories are part of this compendium. So I decided to give them a read, and I have to say, I did enjoy his writing style, and I'll probably be looking for some of the other Lovecraft books now. I also, after reading this, decided to watch Doctor Strange again, as the descriptions of some of the characters in this compendium reminded me of the character from the Doctor Strange movie. So again, like I say, things tend to have different connections and all seem to come up at the right time. December was a bit of a different read. So I began the month with A Brief History of Vampires. And again, this is a book that I found in the discount section, so it was $6. This is by M.J. Trow. And I have to say, I'm very glad that I read this before uploading my video about Vlad Tepes. So I guess I owe that dingleberry in Britain a thank you, because when I had completed my other videos on Dracula and In Search of Dracula, I decided not to upload them because I kept going off on this rant about this guy who thinks he's talking to Vlad or haunted by Vlad or whatever. If you know anything about Vlad Tepes, dead or alive, there's no way he would be anywhere near this individual, but I digress. This book is published after In Search of Dracula, which is from the early 1970s. This book, and yes, again, I have my notes on the inside cover, a few of them. This was published in 2010, so a much more updated version. He even refers to In Search of and some of the information the author shared in that book. Thankfully, as I say, I didn't upload the episode on Vlad Tepes yet, and this will be a perfect match for Hoax or Holy Grail. So now I need to go back through In Search of Dracula, combine it with the information in this one. So perhaps that episode may not be coming up until October 2024, when I typically tend to get into some of those subjects. But we'll see how it goes. Next, completely different from vampires and Vlad Tepes, The Empath's Survival Guide. And this is Life Strategies for Sensitive People. It's written by Judith Orloff, a psychiatrist, and empath herself. On the back are comments from others like Carolyn Miss, Deepak Chopra, and Christine Northrup, all, of course, saying how much they enjoy the book. In the Empath's Survival Guide, Dr. Judith Orloff offers an invaluable resource for highly sensitive people navigating an overwhelming world. Here you will find a practical tool set for honoring your sensitivities while embracing gifts of intuition, compassion, and spiritual connection. This is another book that I first gave a test run at my library, and I found that I enjoyed the information she shares. It's easy to read, not woo-woo stuff. She also has an affirmation at the end of the chapters. There is a lot to be gained from reading this book, whether you consider yourself to be empathic, highly sensitive, or you're just looking to read about and understand a little more about how relationships work, whether that's with adults or with children. There really is a lot to be gained from reading this. Next, I read 21 Rituals to Change Your Life, and I've done a video on that just a few weeks ago. It was a great read. It's easy to understand. The activities don't cost anything. They take a few seconds to a few minutes at the most. I was happy to discover that out of the 21 activities she suggests, I already do 15. So for me, it was a nice validation of being on the right track, and there's just a few more things that I need to incorporate into my day. Now, I don't do things the way she describes them in the book. She has 7 for the morning, 7 for the afternoon, and 7 for the evening. I do them at different times of the day, but to me, it's more important that it's things that I can incorporate into my everyday life rather than having to follow something exactly the way it is in a book. The next book that I finished was Rituals for Self-Care. This is Modern Guides to Ancient Wisdom. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't add it on as my Goodreads total because no matter how many different ways I looked for it, it isn't included in their list of books. This is much like the 21 Rituals to Change Your Habits. The difference is you don't do these daily. They're different ideas for different situations and circumstances that you may be facing. Some of them do cost money. Some may take a few seconds to do. Others may take up to an hour. So things like having a special bath or some meditation exercises. I do recommend giving it a try as it has a lot of great ideas on how to focus on that self-care and make sure that we're in a good place and feeling good and feeling energetic so that we have more to give to other people. I read You Are a Badass for the second time. This is by Jen Sincero. How to Stop Doubting Your Greatness and Start Living an Awesome Life. As I've mentioned when I've talked about this title before, this isn't an author for everyone. She can be quite sarcastic. There's quite a bit of time when she's either talking about her drinking or some drug use. That may be off-putting to some people, but she does have a very no-nonsense way of describing how to feel better about yourself and different things that you can do and incorporate into your life, including how you think about things and how you think about yourself. I'll be doing a video on this particular book probably before the end of the month. Next, I read Spiritual Reiki. This is by Sarah Parker Thomas. Channel your intuitive abilities for energy healing. I did talk about this during one of my live streams. This book is geared towards people who have Reiki, whether you have level 1, 2, or 3. Her work is based on the Usui method, the method that all my training is also in. And she talks about how to do self-care. The back section gives exercises for specific situations. So, for example, things like to remember your dreams or to stimulate physical healing. Now, as I say, she has it geared towards people who have done Reiki and are familiar with that type of energy healing. Personally, I think it would be an enjoyable read for even people who do not have Reiki, and I will be covering this book more in depth in an upcoming video. Yes, my book pile has fallen over. I read Ghosts Among Us. This actually was my first audio book, so I had borrowed it from the library, and as I was doing things, I was listening to the book. But as I was listening, I realized, again, this would be one of those books that I would want to read again, and I would want to highlight and refer back to. And that's something that I did in December. So I listened to it months ago, but then I read my physical copy just a few weeks ago. There were some very interesting points. I should mention this is by James Van Praagh. And I do remember watching the show Ghost Whisperer, and I've seen his book numerous times as I've been on my adventures throughout Indigo. This was published in 2008. Interesting, the same year Sasquatch came out. Uncovering the truth about the other side. So like the afterlife frequency, obviously this individual does believe that there is paranormal, ghosts, spirits. He is a medium who has done readings for people. It's quite well known. It was an enjoyable read, and I'll be talking more about him in an upcoming video. My final read in December was Crossing Over by John Edward, and I do remember watching his program years ago, and it is years ago because we haven't had cable in over a decade. So I remember watching him quite some time ago, and he was an interesting individual then. I know there are a variety of different things said about him. Is he legit? Is he a hoax? No doubt the same is said about James Van Praagh as well as Mark Anthony. The one thing that I did find bothersome about the title is, now it does say the stories behind the stories, but then there's a blurb here about September the 11th, 2001. Personally, I think that could have been left off the cover. The section about September the 11th, 2001 is in the back of the book, and it definitely highlights connections, how small the world really is, and how people get together and share the information when it needs to be shared. Although the cover made me worry about what was this going to be and is it a sales pitch, the way that it's handled in the book is actually quite appropriate and respectful to the trauma and the event that occurred at that time. I certainly remember where I was that day, as no doubt many others do. So I will say that it was handled respectfully. The rest of the book is about John himself, how he became a medium, how his whole career and everything has unfolded. I appreciated that he talked about the challenges and the difficulties, and that things didn't all just flow tickety-boo and everything became wonderful. Too often I find with some books, authors will talk about, if it flows and it's easy, you're on the right path. Personally, I don't think so. Sometimes the universe will test to see how much you actually want something. So you're going to have some times where things flow and go well, and there's going to be some backsteps. That's the human experience, and that's reality. So what I appreciated from this book is that reality part of, no, everything didn't just flow easily for him. There were some major setbacks. And of course, there are the haters and the trolls, and there always will be, regardless. I'm glad that I decided to read this the other day, and it was right after The Ghost Among Us. So it was nice to read that bit of a difference and different take from two different mediums. That was the end of my December 2023 reading. I had set my goal at 75. Thankfully, I had reached that goal earlier in the year, and I actually ended the year at least according to my book, 111 books. I think Goodreads has a couple less, but I've also noticed going through that some of the books I know I added for some reason, haven't been added to my tally. So I'll have to go back and get that figured out. What I also did this year, because a goal that I set for myself in January 2022 was to read my personal library, which, yes, I am a bookaholic, was over 530 books when I set that goal for myself. I know that because I set up on Excel an entire spreadsheet of my books, the author, the dates, the subjects, partly to try and figure out how to organize my cubes so that I could easily find the books when I was looking for them. So this past year, out of my personal library, I managed to read 98 books. I'm very happy about that because that certainly makes a little bit of a dent out of my goal to read my own library. I'll need to go back and check all the books in 2022 to see what I read from my personal library there. I know there are a number, so I've made a little bit of headway there. Although if you've seen any of my book haul videos, you know I'm probably close to 600 books at this point because, of course, I keep finding some new ones either at my local thrift store or when I have a gift card and head over to Indigo for a fun hour or so. The other thing that I want to mention about Goodreads that I really enjoy is that it's easy to track your reading. So here, as you can see, I have from 2022, 2023. Each bar represents a month of the year, and I can easily see the majority of books that I've read, or I can easily see that I read 18 books in 1 month, which was huge for me. The funny thing is, I know that's February, which is the shortest month of the year. Now, when you're on Goodreads, if you move your cursor over these bars, it pops up what you've read that month, which makes it super handy to keep track. Along with being able to see what you've read per month, so you have a neat little graph of how your reading's doing, you could also look at all the books that you've read. It tells you how many pages you've read. This other chart, which I really enjoy, also shows the year of publication dates of the work that you've read. So as you can see, the majority of mine are between 1960 to 2023, but I have a few of the old classics in there, and I'm hoping to add to some of the older books, like I say, because I want to get into reading some more of Lovecraft, as well as some of the other classics that I haven't read yet. Goodreads is a great way to track your personal reading. I wish I had started using it years ago, because it certainly makes it so much easier to see what have I read and when did I read it. As I mentioned in one of my live streams, I'm one of those people who I don't just start a book and finish it all the time. There are some books that I pick it up and just one more chapter, I'll stay up until I've finished that book. It hasn't been unusual for me to be up until 2 or 3 in the morning because I had to know how the book ended. It's been a little while since I've done that, but I do remember particularly the Blackstone Chronicles, which I need to find again, was one of those books that just keeps you going. Other books I pick up, I read a little bit, I find I've got what I needed at the time, I end up going to read something else. All of these I started in 2023, but they'll end up hopefully being finished in 2024. Gods of the New Millennium. This is by Alan F. Alford. It's a big read because he did his work a bit differently than Zecharia Sitchin, who he mentions. And again, this is about the Sumerian culture, the Bible, connecting those timelines. So Alan came up with a different idea and theory, and his work is published a bit later after Zecharia. So I need to finish that. The Caves of the Sun, The Origin of Mythology. This is by Adrian Bailey. Now, part of this will tie in with Zecharia Sitchin and the Earth Chronicles. It will tie back into that whole Da Vinci spiral and symbology, Langford, all of that type of stuff. I read this book a number of years ago, so this will be my second read through. I'm not very far into it just yet. Seth Speaks, The Eternal Validity of the Soul. This is by Jane Roberts. It is work that is channeled. Jane was a trance medium, much like Edgar Cayce. Like Edgar, who had a transcriber while he was speaking, Jane's husband took notes during her session and then would type them up. I began reading this a few months ago. I still have to, as you can see, I still need to finish it. I read this work years ago, and again from my public library. And at the time, I figured I had what I needed from it. But when I saw it a few months ago, and I haven't read Jane's work in quite some time, I decided it was worth another read. As I've also read works by Creon and Esther Hicks, two other people who are channelers, and I'll talk more about that in an upcoming video. Journeys with Plant Spirits. This is by Emma Farrell. Plant Consciousness Healing and Natural Magic Practices. So I began reading this a little while ago, and it's something that I need to definitely get back into, as I'm very interested in connecting with nature, definitely with plants, because to me, having read about biofeedback and other things, plants are as much alive as animals, and their energy and what they provide for us is equally important as the air that we breathe. So I'm looking forward to this read, but it obviously wasn't the time just yet. The Seed of the Soul. This is by Gary Zukav. I read this earlier this year. I found it very inspirational. It has a very positive feeling to it. There are some great suggestions and things to think about. So I need to read that again, and that will, of course, connect in with the other books like The Daily Rituals and You're a Badass. Creon, The Recalibration of Humanity, 2013 and Beyond. This is book 13 in his series. As I said, Creon is channeled work by a gentleman named Lee Carroll. He has been doing this for over, well, according to this book, 23 years. That was 10 years ago. Lee Carroll was an engineer. He wasn't someone planning to become a channel. I know in his earlier works he talks about how that all began, which was rather interesting. I haven't really followed Creon much. I've seen some of the videos on YouTube. I know I read his work way back when, and it just wasn't something that resonated with me for me at the time. I came across this book a few years ago and I decided maybe it was time to pick it up, partly because of the symbol on the front, and that connects in with other books and works that I've read, and I'll talk more about that when I do a video about Creon and the information in this book. I have to say, I'm really glad that I did pick it up just at the end of December. It's very positive. There are some interesting things that we've seen happening in the world. And of course, this was in 2013, so 10 years ago. What I did know hasn't come up yet, and I found this in so many different works. Somehow, nobody told us that COVID was coming. Don't know. To me, I'm thinking that might have been a good heads up, folks. But maybe that's just me, and I'll talk more about that when I get to the book, and I always say it wrong, Medical Medium. And I'll explain when I review that book why it's I think there should have been some information about COVID before COVID happened. Another book I have to finish is Around the Moon by Jules Verne. I still have 2 books to finish from my Jules Verne box set. This book as well as Around the World in 80 Days. So I'll talk more about those books when I do a review of the entire box set. Classic Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories. I got halfway through and then kind of traveled off to other everyday ghost stories and things. Some of the ghost stories have been interesting. Some, to me, didn't seem like they had ghosts, so I might have to reread a few of those and try and figure out what I was missing. Rip Van Winkle, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and Other Stories. I did read Rip Van Winkle. It's a bit of a different version than what I remember reading. These are by Washington Irving. I'm partway through The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and again, it's a story that I know more from the movies, as I've never actually read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So I think when I finish reading Sleepy Hollow this time, I'll definitely be watching one of the movies to find out some of the differences. Maybe I'll watch two, because I'm pretty sure there's one with Johnny Depp and there's and Christopher Walken, and there's another version that I remember seeing. So I'll need to get that finished for sure. I started The Little Spark, and I've talked a bit about this in one of my live streams. 30 Ways to Ignite Your Creativity. I like the way that this is set up. She has different ideas. You don't have to do anything in order. She has a description. So, for instance, Spark 15 has to do with doubt. She has a bit of a description in terms of if you're doubting yourself, things to keep in mind. She has affirmations. She has crystals that you could use. She leaves space that you could write your affirmation. And then she has some empty boxes where you can put a little more information in. Now, personally, I don't know if I'll ever end up writing in this book. I'll likely do my answers in a separate journal. Because as I've said, it's funny. I'll write in my other books down the margin, in the front, highlight, underline, circle, all kinds of things. But when it comes to books like this that talk about journaling and other things, I tend to do a separate journal, because then if I decide to work my way through the book a second or a third time, I'm not swayed by what my answers were before. So it's a fresh, brand new activity for me each time. I know, one of my quirky little things. The last book that I started that I need to finish is Burning Bright. This is by Kelsey J. Patel. Rituals, Reiki, and self-care to heal burnout, anxiety, and stress. Like the other books that I've mentioned, she also has some great ideas, activities, a lot of different things you can incorporate into your everyday or just be mindful of when something comes up. I'll definitely be covering her as well as the other books in a future video. So those are my waiting to be finished books, and chances are before I finish them, I'll end up starting a few other books depending on what I'm going to be looking at and researching at the time. It also explains why I don't have a TBR, and you'll never end up seeing my TBR in a video. Because for me, books end up coming into my hand when I need the information, or when it's going to connect with something else I've just read, or I decide to take a look on my library's website and the catalog, and there's different titles that catch my attention at the time, and I love that I can put them on hold and then go pick them up at my library. Let me know if you enjoyed this video. Give that like button a little tickle. Share your thoughts and ideas, comments down below. Also, if you enjoy content of a bookish nature, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because I also do videos about nature, and Fridays, of course, are my silly cat videos. So if you've turned on that bell, you'll know when I upload content that may be of interest to you. Until next time, be sure to take good care of yourself, and we'll chat soon.